Buckle up, nerds. It's time for the Energy Nerd Show. I'm Bruce.
And I'm Jeannie.
Here we go. The Energy Nerd Show and Tell Show is like a day at the beach, except instead of sand, we have graphs, and instead of ocean water, we have numbers and insights and lines, and there's no sharks, and you can't get the COVID. Who's our guest today?
Today we have Erin Camp. She's a senior associate at Synapse.
Oh, hi, Erin.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
I heard you have a graph.
I do, yeah. I'm talking about batteries and emissions today.
Can you tell us some of the assumptions that went into making this graph?
This graph tells a story about batteries that are operating for peak shaving. The idea behind peak shaving is that a battery would take demand from an on-peak hour and shift it to an off-peak hour. I looked into what the emissions would look like for a battery that's operated like that over the course of a year. The black squiggly line shows the difference between an on-peak and an off-peak marginal emissions rate over the course of a year for PJM, which is a region in the Mid-Atlantic, in the year 2019. As you can see, the difference varies a lot over the course of the year. And where the line goes below zero, that actually means that on average, an off-peak hour has higher marginal emissions than an on-peak hour, which is counterintuitive and pretty unusual, and means that a battery that's operated for peak shaving doesn't always provide an emissions benefit.
So this is a real system PJM for a real year, 2019, the 12 months. And is it a real battery, or is it kind of a hypothetical battery that is layered into the modeling?
It's a hypothetical battery, and typically batteries or lithium ion batteries have an efficiency between like 85 to 92%. And so that means that the battery has losses between 8 and 15%. And so that's where the yellow region on the graph comes in. Depending on a given battery's losses or its efficiency, there's this region of uncertainty where the battery could be causing an increase in emissions or a decrease, or it could be just negligible, depending on what time of year the battery is operating. So I think the important takeaway from this graph is that it really depends on when the battery is shifting energy demand from an on-peak to an off-peak hour in terms of what the emissions impact is. This is a near-term issue because in the future, when there's much more renewables on the grid, this won't be as much of an issue. But this is definitely something to think about when designing a battery system that's operating specifically for peak shaving.
So when people say batteries will help get more renewables on the grid, this graph is telling a different story. Is that partly because PJM just has a small percentage of renewables right now?
In part, that's true, but I think that there's a larger story around that concept, which is batteries absolutely will help us integrate more renewables onto the grid over time by allowing us to use intermittent resources like solar and wind at times when the energy isn't being produced. But that sort of absorbing energy and holding on to it until it is needed is different. It's a different type of operation than what we're discussing here, which is peak shaving. So the message there is that batteries can be operated in a variety of different ways. They provide so many different services to the grid, and the value in retaining renewable energy until it's needed is definitely the biggest environmental benefit in the long-term forecast.
If people are going to use batteries for peak shaving, is there a way to optimize it to also reduce CO2 emissions, or at least improve this story that you're telling right now?
So it's hard to predict what the marginal emissions rate is going to be in any upcoming hour. It's easier to look backwards because we have 2020 hindsight, but it's hard to predict it going forward. But we can take a sort of illustration from historical marginal emissions rates and assume that in the future, the line could look something like this, like the one in PJM in 2019. So if you were to primarily operate a peak shaving battery in the summer months, like in this graph, June and August actually would provide an emissions decrease. That would give you sort of the best guarantee that the battery would be decreasing emissions. But for the months of January to May, and then the winter months, October, November, December, you're almost certainly going to increase emissions by operating that grid-tied battery.
And if we had a price on carbon, people wouldn't be doing this, right?
Probably not. But another thing is that another way to guarantee that there's no emissions associated with operating a battery in the near term is to pair it with a renewable resource.
Can you tell us what tools were used for this? Is it a simulation model or analysis of the PJM dispatch data? How did you calculate these?
This comes directly from PJM's historical emissions report for 2019. And then I layered on the emissions bands, the red, yellow, and green. And based on what we know about battery efficiency, that's where the yellow band comes in and defines sort of the boundaries between the color regions. But you can do this sort of emissions analysis at any granularity level. You can look at it on an annual granularity, monthly, like we're looking at here. And you can also look at it hourly, but an hourly assessment would require more detailed modeling. It can get pretty complex. So I think a monthly analysis it gets the picture across.
Thanks so much, Erin.
No
Cheers.
problem.
Good to see you. Thanks for watching. This is Energy Nerd Show and Tell.
It's the show that we want to watch, so we're thinking maybe some of you energy nerds want to watch it too. If you do, then hey, tell your friends and subscribe right around here. Click there,
And check
or there, or over here.
Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and where
Yeah,
else?
and the Energy Nerd website at energynerdshow.com. You can always go there. And if you want to be a guest, you can volunteer to be a guest. We love to have guests. In fact, that's kind of what the show is all about.
Absolutely.